The wind did not just blow across the frozen river. It screamed. It tore through the pines and whipped the snow into a blinding white fury, burying the wagon ruts and horse tracks that led back to the town of Oakhaven. Elara Hayes dragged herself through the drifts, her hands numb, her knees bruised beneath the heavy, soaked layers of black velvet. It was a wedding dress meant for a winter ceremony, meant to signify her union with Marcus Vance. Now it was a shroud. Her breath cracked in her throat, a dry, rattling sound that tore at her lungs. She had no coat. Marcus had stripped it from her outside the church doors, tossing it into the mud before shoving her down into the snow. "You want to keep secrets, Elara?" His voice echoed in her mind, sharp and venomous. "Keep them in the dark. You can come back inside when you're ready to tell me where the boy is." She would die out here before she told him. Her fingers, turning a dangerous shade of pale blue, were locked tight against her chest. Hidden beneath the ruined bodice of her dress, pressed flush against her freezing skin, was a small, carved wooden horse. It was the only thing she had left of her father, and the only thing her 6-year-old brother Leo cared about. Leo. The thought of him hiding in the dark, freezing cave 3 miles up the ridge sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her failing body. She had hidden him there before the wedding, realizing too late that Marcus didn't want a ready-made family. Marcus wanted the land Leo stood to inherit, and accidents happened so easily to deaf, orphaned boys on the frontier. Elara stumbled, her boots slipping on a patch of black ice. She hit the ground hard. The cold was no longer a stinging pain. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket dragging her down into sleep. Her vision blurred, the edges turning grey. Then she saw it. A single, steady point of yellow light cutting through the blizzard. It was the ferryman's shack, sitting on the edge of the black, rushing river. The townspeople whispered about the man who lived there. Kaelen Cross. A man built like a mountain, who spoke to no one, who worked the heavy ferry ropes with bare hands, and who carried the quiet, dangerous air of a man with nothing to lose. They said he was heartless. They said he cared for nothing but the river. Elara didn't care if he was the devil himself. He had fire. She forced herself up onto her hands and knees. Every movement was agony. The frostbite was sinking into her flesh, making her limbs feel like lead. "Leo," she whispered, her cracked lips splitting further. A drop of warm blood freezing instantly on her chin. "I'm coming. Just hold on." 50 yards. 30 yards. The light grew brighter, spilling from a small square window and throwing a long golden rectangle onto the snow. Elara reached the edge of the light and simply had nothing left. Her arms gave out. She collapsed into the snowbank, her cheek resting against the ice. She clutched the wooden horse tighter to her chest, her eyes fluttering shut. Kaelen Cross brought the heavy iron axe down, shattering the thick layer of ice that had frozen over the main ferry winch. The sharp crack echoed over the roar of the wind and the rushing black water of the river. He didn't wear gloves. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of hauling coarse hemp rope, were accustomed to the biting cold. He was a man who lived his life in rhythm with the brutal seasons. 36 years old, built broad and solid, with eyes as dark and unfathomable as the river he worked. He preferred the isolation. People brought complications, noise and pain. The river only brought ice, and ice he could break. He swung the axe again, clearing the last of the frost. As he turned to rack the tool beneath the porch overhang, a sound caught his ear. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the water. Kaelen went perfectly still, his tall frame tensing. He had survived this long on the frontier by trusting his instincts. He stepped off the wooden porch, his heavy boots crunching into the knee-deep snow, and squinted into the whiteout. Just at the edge of the lantern's reach, a dark shape lay half buried in the snowdrift. Kaelen approached cautiously, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his chest tighten. A woman. She was curled into a tight ball, wearing a ruined, snow-caked black velvet dress. Her dark hair was frozen to her pale cheeks. Kaelen dropped to his knees beside her, stripping off his heavy oilskin coat in one fluid motion. He threw it over her trembling shoulders. "Hey," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He reached out, his massive, rough hand gently touching her face. Her skin was terrifyingly cold, like marble left out in a freeze. She didn't wake, but she whimpered, a small, broken sound, and curled tighter around whatever she was holding against her chest. Kaelen didn't waste time asking questions she couldn't answer. He scooped her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bird caught in a winter gur. He carried her up the porch steps, kicked the heavy wooden door open with his boot, and stepped into the warmth of the shack. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the screaming wind. The shack was small, practical, and fiercely warm. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a hearty fire of dried pine roaring within. Kaelen carried her directly to the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. He set her down gently, quickly moving to drag his own cot mattress closer to the fire. He lifted her onto the mattress and pulled a thick wool blanket from the chest. As he draped it over her, he noticed her hands. They were clamped shut, blue at the knuckles, trembling violently. Kaelen knelt beside her. He knew frostbite. He knew that if he didn't get her blood moving, she would lose those fingers. He reached out, taking her icy hands in his massive, warm palms. He didn't rub them, that would tear the damaged tissue. Instead, he simply enveloped her small hands in his, letting his natural body heat slowly seep into her skin. As the warmth reached her, Elara gasped, her eyes snapping open. Panic, raw and wild, flooded her striking grey eyes. She thrashed, trying to pull away from him, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar timber walls before locking onto the giant of a man kneeling beside her. "Easy," Kaelen said, keeping his voice as low and steady as he could, making no sudden movements. He released, said her hands instantly, raising his empty palms to show he was no threat. "You're safe. You're out of the storm." Elara scrambled backward, her back hitting the base of the stone chimney. Her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. She looked at his broad shoulders, his weathered face, the sheer, immovable size of him. Her mind, still sluggish from the cold, spun wildly. Then she remembered. She gasped, her hands flying to her chest. In her panic, the small carved wooden horse slipped from her frozen fingers and clattered onto the floorboards, coming to rest near Kaelen's heavy boot. The shack fell dead silent. Kaelen looked down at the toy. The carving was rough but careful, a child's treasure. He looked back up at the woman. She was staring at the horse, then at him, her eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than the cold. She was bracing herself, waiting for him to take it, to demand answers, to strike her, or to drag her back to the town that had left her to freeze. Kaelen didn't ask why a woman in a wedding dress was dying in the snow with a child's wooden toy. He didn't ask who she was running from. Instead, he reached down slowly. He picked up the little wooden horse. His hands, rough enough to snap a pine branch, handled the delicate toy with surprising, deliberate gentleness. He held it out to her, resting it on the edge of her blanket. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, turned his back to her to give her privacy, and walked to the cast-iron stove to pour a tin cup of hot water. Elara stared at his broad back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the wooden horse back to her chest. For the first time in her life, a man had held all the power, and he had simply handed it back. The tin cup was pushed gently across the floorboards, coming to rest inches from the edge of Elara's wool blanket. Steam curled from the surface of the hot water, carrying the faint, earthy scent of pine needles. Kaelen Cross retreated to the far side of the small shack. He sat on a wooden stool near the heavy timber door, picking up a thick length of braided river rope and a splicing fid. He went to work, his massive hands weaving the stiff hemp with a practiced mechanical rhythm. He did not look at her. He did not ask for a name, a debt, or an explanation. He simply gave her space. Elara lay on the bearskin rug, her body shivering violently as the shack's heat began to thaw the terrible chill deep in her bones. The pain of returning circulation was excruciating. Her fingers and toes throbbed with a hot, biting ache, making her bite her cracked lip to keep from crying out. She stared at the man across the room. In the flickering firelight, he looked less like a man and more like a fixture of the wild itself, carved from granite and weathered by storms. He wore a heavy flannel shirt underneath his suspenders, his broad shoulders shifting with every pull of the rope. Elara slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position. Her ruined black velvet dress hung heavily on her frame, the hem stiff with melted snow and mud. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the tin cup. The metal was hot, burning her chilled palms, but she welcomed the pain. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The hot pine tea slid down her raw throat, triggering a dry, hacking cough that shook her fragile frame. At the sound of her cough, Kaelen's hands paused on the rope. He didn't look up, but his posture shifted, a subtle tightening of his broad back. "Drink it slow," Kaelen said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the crackle of the hearth. "You swallowed too much winter." Elara lowered the cup. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were raw, swollen, and stained with a terrifying purplish hue. Without a word, Kaelen stood up. He set the rope aside and walked to a small wooden cabinet. He pulled out a tin of salve and a roll of clean, white cotton bandages. He crossed the room and knelt beside her on the rug. Elara flinched, instinctively pulling her knees to her chest, her hand dropping to the wooden horse hidden in the folds of her blanket. Marcus had taught her that a man approaching with purpose always meant pain. Kaelen stopped. He remained kneeling, leaving a careful 2 feet of distance between them. He unscrewed the lid of the tin, the sharp scent of camphor and beeswax filling the space between them. "I need to bind your hands," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were perfectly still, completely devoid of the cruel hunger or arrogant demands she was used to seeing in men's eyes.
Wait.
If you don't keep the air off the frostbite, the skin will split. You'll lose the fingers.
Stay by the fire.
He didn't reach for her. He simply held out his large, calloused hand, palm up, and waited. The choice was hers. Elara swallowed the lump of fear in her throat. Her hands were agonizingly painful, the skin tight and burning. Slowly, tentatively, she uncurled her arms and placed her trembling left hand into his massive palm. His touch was shockingly gentle. Kaelen scooped a small amount of the salve and worked it carefully over her bruised, swollen knuckles. He didn't rub, he pressed, letting the heat of his own skin melt the wax into her wounds. Then, he wrapped the white cotton around her hand, binding it securely but loosely enough to allow blood flow. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly as he began to wrap her right hand. Elara looked away, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "A man who believes that anything he pays for belongs to him," she whispered. The memory of Marcus tearing her coat away in the churchyard made her chest tight. "He wanted to marry me. He bought me father's debts. But when he found out I wouldn't come alone, he decided to get rid of the complication." Kaelen tied off the second bandage. "You ran." "I was thrown out," she corrected, her voice hoarse. "He told me I could come back inside when the cold finally broke my mind, when I was ready to tell him the truth." Kaelen looked at her bandaged hands, then down at the small wooden horse resting near her knee. "What truth?" A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the timber walls of the shack, rattling the heavy iron latch on the door. The sound hit Elara like a physical blow. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the room, the gentle hands of the ferryman, it all shattered. She looked toward the frosted window, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The storm. She had been unconscious. How long? An hour? 2? "Oh, God!" Elara gasped. Panic, cold and sharp as a blade, sliced through her. She threw the wool blanket off and scrambled to her feet, her bandaged hands slipping on the floorboards. "Leo, what time is it? How long have I been here?" Kaelen stood up quickly, his massive frame blocking her path to the door. "Long enough to thaw. Sit back down. You're not going anywhere in that." He gestured toward the raging whiteout beyond the glass. "Move!" Elara demanded, her voice cracking with terror. She pushed against his solid chest, but it was like trying to shove a mountain. "I have to go back. I have to go back for him." Kaelen caught her by the shoulders, his grip firm enough to stop her thrashing, but careful enough not to bruise. "Who is Leo?" he demanded, his low voice cutting through her rising hysteria. Elara stopped fighting, her knees suddenly weak. She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and desperate. "My brother," she choked out. "He's 6 years old. He's deaf." Marcus was going to kill him. "An accident on the river," he said, "so he could take the land." She grabbed handfuls of Kaelen's flannel shirt, her bandaged hands clumsy and frantic. "I hid him. Before the wedding, I took him up the ridge. There's an old bear cave past the tree line. I told him to stay there in the dark. I told him not to move until I came for him. But the storm, he has no coat, no fire. He can't hear the wind, but he can feel the cold. I have to go get him."
Not anymore.
Kaelen Cross froze. The words hit him like a physical strike to the jaw. A boy, 6 years old, deaf, hidden in the freezing dark.
Not anymore.
The roaring in his ears was suddenly louder than the blizzard outside. It was the sound of rushing black water, the memory of a small hand slipping from his grasp a lifetime ago. He had spent 10 years living in silence, punishing himself on this frozen river because he had failed to hold on to his own little brother. He looked down at the woman trembling in his grip. She was half dead, her lips still pale, wearing a ruined wedding dress. She was in no condition to walk 10 feet, let alone climb a mountain in a whiteout. "Let me go," Elara sobbed, her strength failing. "Please, he's all I have. He's alone." Kaelen released her shoulders. Elara stumbled backward, expecting him to drag her back to the fire, to tell her she was crazy, to lock the door. Instead, Kaelen, his jaw hardened, a muscle ticking in his weathered cheek. He knew the men of Oakhaven. They were shopkeepers and drunkards, not trackers. But Marcus Vance had money, and money could buy men who knew how to hunt. "They have dogs," Elara whispered, the blood draining from her already pale face. She tightened her grip on Kaelen's coat, where little Leo was still bundled against the ferryman's chest. "They tracked my scent from the church. Marcus, he won't leave witnesses, Kaelen. If he finds us in here, we have nowhere to run." "We aren't staying here," Kaelen said flatly. He moved with startling speed for a man of his immense size. He secured the heavy parka around Elara, then shrugged out of his own oilskin coat, wrapping it entirely around the boy. He tied the sleeves around his own neck, fashioning a makeshift sling that bound Leo securely to his broad, flannel-clad chest. The child was awake now, his striking grey eyes, so like his sister's, wide with confusion. He couldn't hear the hounds, but he could feel the frantic vibration of Kaelen's heartbeat and Elara's trembling hands. Elara touched Leo's cheek, offering a desperate, reassuring smile. The boy clutched the carved wooden horse tightly in his small fist, burying his face into Kaelen's neck. "The main trail is compromised," Kaelen said, handing Elara the iron lantern. "We take the goat path down the far side of the ridge. It drops straight to the river gorge. If we can reach the ferry barge, we cross the water and cut the mooring line. They won't be able to follow." "What about your shack?" Elara asked, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. "Wood and stone," Kaelen replied, his voice devoid of attachment. "Let them have it." He stepped out of the cave and into the blinding whiteout. Elara followed, her bandaged hands gripping the rope Kaelen had once again tethered between them. The descent was a nightmare of ice and gravity. The goat path was barely a foot wide, a treacherous ribbon of snow-slick stone that wound down the sheer face of the mountain. Below them, unseen in the dark, the black river roared like a starving beast. Kaelen led the way, his boots kicking heavy steps into the ice to create footholds for Elara. He moved with a brutal, grounded grace, balancing the weight of the child on his chest while anchoring Elara with the rope. The baying of the hounds grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, no longer a distant threat, but a rapidly closing reality. Marcus's men were pushing hard, driving the dogs through the storm with ruthless desperation. The wind lashed at them, driving shards of ice into their skin. Elara's legs screamed with exhaustion. The ruined hem of her wedding dress was completely shredded, heavy with frozen mud. But every time she felt her knees buckle, the thick hemp rope around her waist would go taut, and the immovable weight of Kaelen Cross would hold her upright. He was a silent, unyielding pillar in a world that was trying to tear her apart. They reached the riverbank just as a break in the storm revealed a pale, ghostly moon. The ferry station was a heavy timber dock built over churning, freezing rapids. The barge itself was a massive wooden platform tethered to a thick steel cable that spanned the 100-yard gorge. It was operated by a heavy hand winch and guided by a secondary hemp line thicker than a man's forearm. Kaelen untied Elara and quickly guided her onto the pitching wooden deck of the barge. "Get to the center. Keep the boy low," he ordered, unwrapping Leo from his chest and placing the child into Elara's arms. Before Kaelen could unhook the heavy iron mooring ring, a gunshot cracked through the freezing air. The bullet struck the timber post inches from Kaelen's head, showering his face with wood splinters. From the tree line just above the dock, 5 lanterns emerged. Mark. As Vance stepped into the pale moonlight, flanked by 4 rugged mercenaries holding rifles. 2 massive tracking hounds strained against their leather leashes, snarling viciously, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. Marcus looked down at the dock. He was dressed in a pristine, heavy wool coat, looking entirely out of place in the brutal wilderness. His eyes fell on Elara, huddled on the barge with the boy, and his mouth twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer. "I have to admit, Elara," Marcus shouted over the roar of the river, "I didn't think you had it in you. Dragging a deaf cripple through a blizzard in a wedding dress, it's almost poetic. But this ends now." He waved a gloved hand dismissively at Kaelen. "Step aside, Ferryman. You've played the hero long enough. Hand over the boy, and I'll let you keep the woman." Kaelen Cross did not speak. He stood at the edge of the dock, his massive frame planted squarely between the armed men and the barge. He wore no coat, only his flannel shirt and suspenders, entirely immune to the freezing wind. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down to the dock and picked up a 3-foot length of braided river rope. One end was tied into a massive, weighted, monkey's fist knot, a tool used to throw lines across the water, heavy and dense as a cannonball. He wrapped the other end around his calloused wrist. Marcus laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound. You're going to fight rifles with a piece of rope? Kill him." 2 of the mercenaries raised their rifles. Kaelen moved. He didn't retreat to the barge. He lunged forward, closing the distance with terrifying, explosive speed. The first man barely had time to pull the trigger. The shot went wide as Kaelen swung the weighted rope. The heavy knot struck the man's jaw with a sickening, bone-crunching crack, dropping him instantly into the snow. The second man fired. The bullet grazed Kaelen's left shoulder, tearing through flannel and flesh, but the giant ferryman didn't even flinch. He used his momentum to barrel into the man, driving a massive knee into his ribs and throwing him bodily off the dock into the freezing, rushing rapids below. The man's scream was swallowed instantly by the black water. "Drop the dogs!" Marcus screamed, his arrogance shattering into panic. The handler released the leashes. The 2 hounds launched themselves at Kaelen, jaws snapping. Kaelen caught the first dog mid-leap, his thick forearm locking under its jaw, and hurled the beast back into the snowbank. The second dog sank its teeth into Kaelen's calf. Kaelen grunted, a low sound of pure, gritty endurance, and struck the hound with the heavy rope knot, forcing it to release. Elara watched from the barge, clutching Leo to her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like. Kaelen wasn't fighting like a soldier or a gunslinger. He was fighting like a force of nature, brutal, practical, and entirely focused on keeping the threat away from her. He was an avalanche of muscle and will. Marcus, realizing his men were being dismantled by a man armed with nothing but rope and rage, raised his own pistol, aiming squarely at Elara on the barge. "Stop!" Marcus roared, "or she dies right now." Kaelen froze. He stood panting in the snow, blood seeping from his shoulder and his leg, the heavy rope dripping in his hand. He looked at Marcus, then at Elara. "Step away from the mooring line," Marcus ordered, his hand trembling as he aimed the gun. "Walk away, Cross." Kaelen looked at the heavy iron winch holding the ferry to the dock. He looked at Elara. Their eyes met across the freezing distance. In her striking grey eyes he saw no surrender. She clutched the wooden horse and her brother tightly, her chin raised in that fierce, defiant angle he was coming to know so well. Kaelen didn't walk away. With a sudden, violent pivot, he drove his heavy leather boot not at Marcus, but directly into the locking lever of the massive ferry winch. The lever snapped. The tension of the river, holding the heavy wooden barge against the current, was released in a catastrophic explosion of force. The primary mooring line, as thick as a man's thigh, whipped violently across the dock. "Down!" Kaelen roared, throwing his massive body onto the wooden planks. The heavy rope lashed out like a striking serpent. It caught Marcus Vance and his remaining man squarely in the chest, sweeping them off their feet with a bone-shattering impact. Marcus's pistol fired harmlessly into the sky as he was thrown backward into the snowdrifts, completely incapacitated. The barge, no longer anchored to the near shore, lurched violently. The rushing black current caught the wooden hull, ripping it away from the dock. Kaelen scrambled to his feet. The barge was already 6 feet out and accelerating fast, swinging toward the middle of the gorge on its overhead steel cable. "Kaelen!" Elara screamed, abandoning the safety of the center deck and rushing toward the edge, reaching out her bandaged hand. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He backed up 2 steps, the storm raging around him, and launched his massive frame over the freezing black water. He hit the heavy timber edge of the barge hard, his boots slipping on the icy wood. For one terrifying second, he hung halfway off the platform, his wounded shoulder screaming in agony as he gripped the railing. The black, churning rapids roared just inches beneath his boots, hungry to pull him under. Then, 2 small bandaged hands grabbed the thick suspenders on his back. Elara threw her entire weight backward, pulling with a fierce, desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. With her leverage, Kaelen hauled himself over the railing, collapsing onto the frozen deck of the barge. He lay there on his back, panting heavily, blood staining the shoulder of his flannel shirt. Above him the storm raged, but the sounds of the hounds and the violent men were already fading, swallowed by the roar of the river as the ferry swung safely toward the untamed, inaccessible wilderness of the far shore. Elara crawled over to him. She didn't say a word. She just leaned down, pressing her cold, trembling forehead against his chest, right over his racing heart, while little Leo huddled safely at their side. They had crossed the black water, but they were now trapped on the far side of the mountain, alone in the brutal winter, and Kaelen Cross was bleeding. The barge slammed against the heavy timber pilings of the far shore, the impact rattling through Elara's bones. The overhead steel cable groaned, protesting the immense weight of the ice and the violent swing of the river. Kaelen was already moving. He grunted, clutching his bleeding left shoulder, but hauled his massive frame up from the frozen deck. He threw a secondary mooring line around a rusted iron cleat, securing the heavy wooden barge so it wouldn't drift back into the treacherous current. "There's a winch house," Kaelen shouted over the screaming wind, pointing to a dark, square shape nestled in the dense pines 50 yards up the snowy bank. "I keep." It's stocked for winter repairs. "Go." Elara gripped Leo's small hand. The boy was shivering again, the oversized oilskin coat dragging in the snow behind him. She hurried toward the structure, Kaelen walking backward behind them, his dark eyes scanning the opposite shore. Across the black water, Marcus and his men were nothing but distant, fading lanterns fading into the whiteout. They were trapped on the Oakhaven side. The river was completely impassable without the ferry. The winch house was much smaller than Kaelen's main shack, essentially a single room built of thick, interlocking cedar logs. It smelled of heavy grease, hemp rope, and dry wood. Kaelen shoved the door shut against the gale and threw the heavy iron bolt. Instantly, the deafening roar of the storm was muffled. Kaelen moved immediately to a small cast-iron stove in the center of the room. He struck a match with one hand, lighting the dry pine kindling already laid inside. Within minutes, a small, fierce fire pushed the freezing dark back into the corners of the room, casting dancing orange shadows against the timber. Only then did the adrenaline seem to leave him. Kaelen swayed, his massive shoulders slumping, and he sank heavily onto a wooden crate. Blood was dripping steadily from the torn flannel at his shoulder, pooling darkly on the floorboards. The leg of his trousers was shredded where the hound had clamped its jaws, the fabric soaked through. "Ella." He didn't hesitate. She shed the heavy fur parka, her ruined black velvet dress dragging on the floor, and knelt directly in front of him. "Take the shirt off," she ordered. Her voice trembled, but there was no fear of him in it, only a fierce, desperate fear for him. Kaelen looked at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain. He didn't argue. He carefully worked his right arm out of the sleeve, but the left was stuck, the blood having frozen the flannel directly to the open wound. "Wait," Elara said. She hastily unwrapped her bandaged hands. Her knuckles were raw, swollen, and aching terribly, but she needed the dexterity of her fingers. She found a rusted tin basin on a shelf, scooped a handful of snow into it to melt on the hot stove, and tore a clean strip of white cotton from the petticoat beneath her ruined wedding dress. She washed the frozen, crusted blood from his shoulder. Kaelen didn't make a single sound, though the muscles of his broad, scarred chest corded as tight as steel cable. The bullet had taken a clean, brutal gouge out of the meat of his shoulder, a fraction of an inch deeper, and it would have shattered the collarbone. The dog bite on his calf was ugly, deep punctures weeping dark red blood. "You need stitches," Elara whispered, cleaning the bite with the hot water. "There's a needle and gut thread in the tin box above the stove," Kaelen grunted, his head tipped back against the log wall, his eyes squeezed shut. Elara found the tin. Her heart shook violently as she threaded the thick needle. She was a seamstress of dresses, not flesh. But as she knelt back down beside his leg, she felt a small, warm hand touch her knee. Leo had crawled out of the heavy oilskin coat. He stood beside her in his thin wool jacket, his striking grey eyes fixed on the blood, then up at the giant man. The boy wasn't afraid. He reached out and placed his small hand directly over Kaelen's uninjured right hand, holding on tight. Kaelen opened his eyes. He looked down at the deaf boy. The mountain of a man, capable of breaking a mercenary's jaw with a knot of rope, let out a long, slow breath. He turned his hand over and gently wrapped his massive, rough fingers around the boy's small ones. "Do it," Kaelen said to Elara, his voice a steady rumble. Elara pushed the needle through his skin. Kaelen barely flinched, his focus entirely on the boy. He tapped a rhythm on the back of Leo's hand with his thumb, a steady, calming beat. 1, 2, 1, 2. The boy watched Kaelen's face, grounding the giant in the pain. When she finished tying off the last stitch on his leg, Elara sat back on her heels, completely exhausted. She washed her bloody hands in the basin and slumped against the wall near the heat of the stove. The shack fell into a deep, heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the iron stove and the distant, muffled howl of the blizzard outside. Leo let go of Kaelen's hand. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out his prized possession, the carved wooden horse. But the violent escape had taken a toll. One of the horse's wooden legs had snapped off completely during the frantic struggle on the dock, lost forever in the snow. Leo stared at the broken toy. He didn't cry, but his small face crumpled into a mask of profound, silent grief. He held the broken piece of wood in his palm, offering it to Elara with a trembling lip. Before Elara could reach out, Kaelen moved. He leaned forward and gently took the broken horse from the boy's palm. He examined it in the dim firelight. Then the ferryman reached down to his boot and drew his heavy, razor-sharp hunting knife. Elara tensed instinctively, but Kaelen didn't even look at her. He reached over and pulled a thick piece of dry cedar firewood from the pile near the stove. With precise, deliberate strokes of the heavy blade, he began to whittle. Leo moved closer, sitting cross-legged right at Kaelen's boots, completely mesmerized. The giant's hands, so heavily scarred from rope and ice, moved with a surprising, delicate grace. Wood shavings curled and fell to the floor like fresh snow. For an hour, Kaelen worked in absolute silence. Elara watched them, a heavy, aching lump forming in her throat. She looked at this man, a man the town of Oakhaven called a beast, a heartless recluse who cared for nothing. Shh! He saw the blood staining his trousers, shed willingly to protect a woman and child he didn't even know. She saw the gentle, patient way he shifted his wounded shoulder so the boy could better see the carving take shape. Marcus Vance had worn fine, expensive suits and spoken of the law, but he was a monster. Kaelen Cross wore stained flannel and carried a deadly blade, but he was a sanctuary. Kaelen finally wiped the blade on his trousers and sheathed the knife. He blew the sawdust from the wood and held it out. It wasn't a clumsy repair of the broken leg. He had carved an entirely new horse. It was slightly larger, thicker, with a broad chest and heavy, sturdy legs, a workhorse, built to carry weight, built to survive the harsh frontier. It looked remarkably like Kaelen himself. Leo took the new horse, his eyes wide with absolute wonder. He traced the smooth, warm cedarwood, then looked up at Kaelen. The boy didn't need words. He launched himself forward, wrapping his small arms as far around Kaelen's massive neck as he could reach, burying his face directly into the ferryman's broad chest. Kaelen froze. His hands hovered awkwardly in the air for a second, before coming down to rest gently on the boy's small back. He closed his eyes, and in the flickering light of the iron stove, Elara saw the distinct sheen of a tear slip down the giant's weathered cheek, disappearing silently into his rough beard. "I had a brother," Kaelen whispered, his voice incredibly thick, speaking to the fire as he held the boy tight. "His name was Thomas. He was 8. The ice broke on the river. I wasn't fast enough with the rope." Elara felt the words strike her straight through the heart. It explained everything. The isolation, the relentless punishing work on the ferry. He had spent 10 years guarding the freezing river that took his blood, punishing himself with the cold because he felt he didn't deserve the warmth. Elara crawled across the floorboards. She didn't stop at the edge of his space. She moved right up to his side, resting her head gently against his uninjured right shoulder, leaning her exhausted weight completely against his solid frame. "You were fast enough tonight," Elara said softly, her voice carrying the absolute, undeniable truth. "You held on, Kaelen. You saved him. You saved both of us." Kaelen turned his head. His dark, fathomless eyes met hers, and for the first time, the impenetrable wall of his isolation was entirely gone. He saw the ruined black velvet wedding dress, the bandaged, frost-bitten hands, and the sheer, unbroken dignity of a woman who had refused to surrender her family to a cruel world. Slowly, hesitantly, Kaelen lifted his heavy, calloused hand. He brushed a tangled lock of auburn hair from her pale cheek, his touch lighter than a falling leaf. "Nobody is taking you back," Kaelen swore, the vow rumbling deep and permanent in his chest. "Marcus Vance crosses this river. He drowns. You stay here. You're safe." Elara closed her eyes, leaning fully into the rough warmth of his palm. The wind screamed outside the thick timber walls, but inside the small winch house, the world was finally quiet. She had spent her whole life waiting for a storm to break her. Instead, she had found the one man strong enough to break the storm. The thaw came slowly to the gorge, but when it finally broke the spine of winter, it did so with a deafening roar. The thick sheets of ice that had choked the Black River for months fractured and shattered, swept away by the surging, muddy meltwater of spring. The air, once sharp enough to slice skin, now carried the rich, damp scent of thawing pine needles and wet earth. Elara stood on the porch of the main ferry shack, wiping her hands on a clean canvas apron. The ruined black velvet wedding dress had been burned in the stove months ago, replaced by a simple, sturdy dress of blue homespun cotton she had sewn herself. Her hands were fully healed, the terrible blue swelling of frostbite having faded into faint, silvery scars across her knuckles. Marks of survival she no longer felt the need to hide. She looked out toward the wooden dock. The ferry barge, which Kaelen had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously repairing and re-anchoring, bobbed gently in the strong current. Sitting on the edge of the dock, their legs dangling over the water, were Kaelen and Leo. The giant ferryman was no longer wearing his heavy oilskin coat. His flannel shirt was rolled up to the elbows, exposing the thick, corded muscles of his forearms and the flat, puckered scar on his left shoulder where the Mercenaries' bullet had struck him. He held a length of thick hemp rope in his hands. Beside him, Leo was watching with absolute, undivided attention. The boy held a smaller, thinner piece of rope. Kaelen didn't speak. He didn't need to. He slowly looped the hemp, crossing the tail over the standing line, pulling it through to form a perfect bowline knot. He tapped the wood of the dock once to get the boy's attention, then untied it, holding his hands out, offering Leo the space to try. Leo mirrored the movements. His small fingers, clumsy at first, wrestled with the stiff rope. Kaelen didn't take over. He waited, a mountain of patience, until the boy finally pulled the knot tight. Kaelen inspected it, then reached out and ruffled Leo's dark hair, his massive hand covering the boy's head entirely. A wide, gap-toothed smile broke across Leo's face. The boy proudly set the knotted rope down next to the sturdy cedar workhorse Kaelen had carved for him on that brutal winter night. A toy that had not left the boy's side in 3 months. Elara felt a profound, aching warmth bloom in her chest. She walked down the wooden steps, the spring sunshine warming her face. Kaelen heard her approach. He turned, his dark, fathomless eyes catching the light. The heavy, punishing shadow that had hung over him all winter, the ghost of the brother he couldn't save, was gone. In its place was a quiet, fiercely protective peace. "He's a fast learner," Kaelen said, his low voice carrying easily over the rushing water. "He has a good teacher," Elara replied, stepping onto the dock. Kaelen stood up, his massive frame towering over her, yet Elara had never felt safer in her life. He reached out, his rough,